always thought that fusion was something that's going to happen in my children's lifetime. Now it looks like it's going to happen in our lifetimes, and maybe might even sort out some of the biggest problems that we have. Really interesting stuff. And the fact that it's happening, some of it's happening in Oxford, not far from here, that's good to know. So what are we going to discuss next? We are going to talk about a subject that we all have opinions on, and that is e-vehicles. I'm sure many of you have thought, is it time to buy? No, etc. This is your time to put your questions to our panelists, because we are not going to be able to decarbonize without massively cleaning up the transport sector. It's responsible for some 25% of global emissions. We have got to electrify it. How fast can we get there? What are the constraints going to be? That's what we're going to be discussing now. Let me introduce you to our panelists. From Jaguar Land Rover, we're delighted to welcome Director of Public Affairs, Murray Paul. Murray, where are you? Make yourself comfortable. We've all heard of Jaguar Land Rover, right? Now, you may not have heard of Peec Mobility, which is a very cool business model. Let me introduce you to the founder, Zach Faizal. Zach, please, welcome. And from a consultancy, Roland, Berger, the global lead for e-mobility, is joining us. I think he just flew in from Dubai. Arvind, CJ. Mr. Arvind, please. I'm going to take the example of Ben and stand over here, if you don't mind, so that we're not all kind of in one line. Panelists, may I ask you to ignore me and please speak here, right? Because otherwise, it's hard to tell what people are saying. So the first thing I'm going to ask our panelists to do is just tell us what they are doing currently, and then we can look at some of the constraints on really accelerating EV ownership and deployment. So if I may start with you, Murray, I'm going to ask you a cheeky question. So the first thing you think about when you think about EVs is not Jaguar Land Rover, right? I looked it up, and they only have one model on the market right now. So what are your ambitions? Why are you late to the game?
I wouldn't characterize it as late. I think it's all about timing. Different manufacturers are a different size and can adopt different strategies. And whilst we're a very well-known brand in the UK, we're actually a relative minnow on the global stage of EV. So it's all about timing your entry onto the market and making sure you get that right. I fully accept from an external view of you just look at our website configure and what do we sell. You could suggest that we're late. If you're inside our business, there is literally nothing else we are working on. So we will go from a position of one EV on the market today to by 2026, 80% of all cars that we will sell on the market will be have an EV available on them. By 2030, 80% of all cars that we will sell globally will be electric vehicles. So,
wow, that's a massive transition for Jaguar Land Rover.
A huge step change in what is relatively a short period of time, and it comes back to what I said at the start. It's about timing your entry onto the market.
Right. So you think it's better to wait till the market gets some lift off and then really fully embrace it?
For a business our size.
Right. Right.
It won't make sense to a much larger business that's able to transition its portfolio gradually over time.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense. Let's talk in a little while about how to get the market to lift off, right? Zach Faizal. So Peec Mobility, tell us a little bit about it. It's a bit of a different approach from what I can make out. You're recycling existing petrol and diesel engines. What's the logic?
Yeah, it's pretty unconventional. It's not the norm. But I think with anything of the scale of climate, it's pretty important that we question the status quo. And for us in particular, when we looked at the transport industry, we had to look at the practicalities of it, right? So we have 1.6 billion cars. The goal is by 2030, 30% should be electric. Today we're at 3%. To any typical OEM, I think Mari can correct me, but it takes about 3 to 4 years to develop a brand new car from scratch. It takes about 3-4 years to set up a gigafactory from scratch. So when we have 6 years left and 500 million electric cars put on the road, practically does it seem possible? So that's one big issue that I saw. The second is the results. I mean, if you look at the transport sector emissions over the last 3 years, we're up 3%. Even though we're seeing a massive EV boom that we call, there's still a massive increase in emissions.
So are you seeing interest in this idea of recycling existing cars?
I think more than interest, it's a realization, because everyone is realizing you can't look at electrification in a singular lens. You need to have multiple alternative solutions, and repurposing mobility is not the end goal, but it is a perfect transitionary solution. It's affordable, it's practical, and it's immediate.
So you call it repurposing?
Yeah, so our goal is to repurpose as many vehicles as we can to electric.
Okay. And advantages of that, apart from speed, is it cheaper?
Absolutely. So when you manufacture a car, it's usually built for 25, 30 years. We often discard it after 10, 15. We repurpose that important asset. So it's 30% more affordable, 30% less emissions, and a fraction of the time.
Sounds good, right? Let's find out a bit more about what Arvind is working on and Roland Berger. A big project in Saudi to try and create a whole auto infrastructure in Saudi Arabia. Now, do they have any car building expertise in Saudi at the moment?
No, unfortunately, right? So that's the short answer, but that's essentially what the challenge which we are, let's say, taken on right now. So what's happening right now is that the whole of Middle East is trying to transition away from oil, right? So even from an economic perspective. And what that is kind of leading to is that they want to look at automotive manufacturing as one of the key pillars for this economic diversification. The good part, also a bit confusing in my view, is that they have fully gone towards electric vehicle production rather than, let's say, focusing a bit on ICE and so on. And given that they don't have, let's say, the typical, let's say, existing infrastructure of, let's say, ICE production and so on, they've been able to kind of avoid that step entirely and move into like fully battery electric vehicles today. And again, it's not only, let's say, the battery electric which they're talking about, they're also looking at hydrogen fuel cell related mobility and all of it. And they are fundamentally working with some of the new age, let's say, manufacturers and the conventional manufacturers to kind of get this scale within, let's say, the Middle East.
And what are the challenges of creating an auto industry from scratch? I mean, Jaguar Land Rover, yeah, they have created a plan and decided it makes sense to start a bit later because you want a market to be established. But they have been building cars in Coventry for a very long time, right? So how do you start a whole industry from scratch?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is a bit of a cost disadvantage or a capability disadvantage which you start off with. At the same time, given the kind of, let's say, talent migration which happens these days, it's not such a difficult thing either. So the goal is that you are able to partner with, let's say, the global OEMs to bring that capability in and also train the local people. So that's the reason why you have specific academies now which have been purpose-built for this one, let's say for the automotive sector, to kind of, let's say, build the capabilities locally. And we see this happening not only in automotive, for aerospace and a few other areas as well. This is something which is happening. So quite an exciting time for, let's say, the whole of Middle East in terms of the transition for them to go into manufacturing of electric vehicles.
Well, it's good to hear. The more people in the market, the better. So how is the market going to really get liftoff in the timelines that we have? Cost is an issue. They are more expensive than internal combustion engine vehicles. The market is clearly not pushing us towards buying EVs unless you live in certain countries like Norway. So I want to ask you, Murray, what are your thoughts on the current cost disadvantage of EVs, and how can we use either government interventions or novel business models to try and make it more attractive to consumers to go this way?
So I suppose the understanding the drivers, I mean, you spoke a little bit about it when you started. Transport emissions are the single largest sector of emissions. Passenger car within that is the single largest segment within transport emissions. So, we as an organisation and an industry absolutely recognise that. And I don't know any car company that disagrees with that. We may disagree about the journey to get there, but we don't disagree about that. And I think the same is true for governments. You know, that you see around the world various mandates and regulations that places a burden on the industry to increase car sales year on year for electric vehicle. And that's great, but what it usually fails to address is the consumer in it, the person that actually is going to put their hand in his or her wallet and make that purchasing decision to go and buy the cars.
Exactly.
And the status quo is that a battery is significantly more expensive today than an internal combustion engine, by almost a factor of 2. And to manage this transition, we must operate profitable businesses. We can't trade away those margins, and certainly for the mass car market, those margins don't exist to trade away in the first place. They're operating on a really small margin. So we do have an imbalanced equation that we need to solve in there. And it's all very well telling consumers, well, the total cost of ownership is much better if you drive an EV, but the hurdle to get in there, if it's too high to unlock the savings in the first place.
So the running costs are low, but the upfront cost is super high.
And over the lifetime of the vehicle, it will be lower. But if you can't get into it in the first place, so we need interventions to make that happen. And I'll give you 3 good examples of where interventions work, and that applies in the UK as much as it does anywhere else in the world. The first is, providing incentivisation. If we look at this country, for example, we've got incentivisation if you're a company car owner. We give you really low, if not zero, benefit in kind rates. And we see that directly driving market behaviour. But that doesn't exist for the private consumer, and we see the complete, reverse of the situation, where it's 30% penetration for fleet sales, it's 10% for things. So we can help in that respect. We also need to look all the way other at the...
We can help, meaning?
Giving help to the consumers to lower the price of the car in there, so that whether it's through VAT or something
so
like that.
The government making sure that there are incentives.
Yes,
okay.
that's one, because we're in a climate race, aren't we? The second is we need to establish the value of these batteries. And that's all about understanding the recycled value of the batteries. And why does that make sense to unlocking that? Well, if we can establish the value of the batteries and the recycled content of that batteries, and it reaches a stable, good price, it becomes